Hello and good evening. Welcome everyone on behalf of Humanities Tennessee, and thank you to our key sponsors, Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Ingram Content Book Group, Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. I want to welcome everyone to this incredible session. If you're watching on Facebook Live or YouTube, please add questions. The questions will be brought to me, and I'm happy to bring them into the conversation throughout the next 45 minutes. And as a reminder, the festival is free. It's a nonprofit event that is supported in part by donations from individuals. So if you appreciate the event and want to support it, you can do so in the app or by visiting the website www.humtn.org. So I'm very, very privileged to welcome our special guest tonight, Kim Stanley Robinson, a New York Times bestseller and winner of the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards. He's the author of more than 20 books, including the best-selling Mars trilogy and the critically acclaimed 40 Signs of Rain, The Years of Rice and Salt, and 2312. In 2008, he was named a Hero of the Environment by Time magazine, and he works with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute. He lives in Davis, California. So welcome, Stan.
Hi there, Sophie. Good to be with you.
Yes, thank you. I wish we could be in person, but at least we're here not wearing masks and having a lower carbon footprint.
Yeah, It's
so
a new dispensation, and it's working pretty well. Obviously, if people who have checked in have gotten used to it too, so I appreciate that.
Right, one of many ways where our culture may have shifted for the good in this really trying time. So I'm really pleased to be talking about Ministry for the Future, an expansive book that starts in this moment of crisis, a crisis that I feel like after a lot of the climate catastrophes of this summer seems all the more real and possible, and ends helping us to envision a future where we actually are able to come together in a global, very messy way to actually solve some of the crises that are facing us. And so, you've written about the need for more utopic visions around climate. And I'm wondering if you can just walk us through a little of your motivation in addressing that with this book.
Sure. My pleasure, really. I've been a utopian science fiction writer for most of my career. So this goes back 30 years at least, maybe getting closer to 35. And what I mean by utopian science fiction is just imagining positive futures rather than negative ones. It's a pretty simple cut. And everybody is a science fiction writer in their private life when they plan their future, and everybody does utopias which express their hopes. Like, if I want to get to a good life, I need to do these things now. And so it's a kind of planning session. And then also fears, dystopia, or post-apocalyptic situations, the fears that sometimes strike in the middle of the night. Things are going badly. I've got problems of money, health, family. There's all kinds of problems. And so you have a negative vision. Oh, it all could go wrong. So this is what utopia and dystopia does on the level of literature. And I feel like we've got enough dystopian visions out there, and they're relatively easy. Yeah, things could go wrong in any number of ways. The utopian imaginary is a much less populated mental space, at least in literature. Everybody's got hope, and indeed, if you don't, you're in big trouble. It's a name for a problem, hopelessness. But most people being alive, you hope. Even hunger is a kind of hope. So writing down positive futures has been my project, and it's varied. Sometimes I've felt more or less hopeful about human civilization, but certainly it's been massively complicated by the climate crisis. So over the last 20 years or so, I've been writing against the tide of increasing danger from the climate crisis and the ways, that's one way of naming all the ways that human beings and civilization are out of whack with the biosphere itself and what the biosphere can provide for us. So we're wrecking the only home that we have, and the home that gives us everything that we need in terms of food, shelter, etc. So then, well, utopian fiction begins to shift, and in essence, the bar gets lower. And so with Ministry for the Future, I guess I'm saying, look, this is one of the best case scenarios I'm writing down. It's still filled with trouble and discord and chaos and defeats and disasters for people trying for a better world. And yet it still comes out okay in the sense of this. We dodged the mass extinction event that is coming down on us right now and get into a potentially long-term viable relationship with the biosphere that includes justice and sustainability. So I've lowered the bar so that the book is still maybe believable while you read it, but I'm still talking about a positive future, that we can make it and therefore we should make it.
Yeah, so Ezra Klein referred to it last year as the most important book he'd read that year. Bill McKibben's review in the New York Review of Books was titled, "It's Not Science Fiction." I think there is such a need for hope right now and like possible paths forward. I had the opportunity earlier this year to interview Katharine Hayhoe, this leading climate scientist who does a lot of public outreach work. And she said that is the most common question that she gets asked when she gives talks is, how do you find hope today? And so I feel like this is such an important book, especially right now, right? Where I feel like this past summer, I think a lot of us have kind of felt like we are in the future of the climate crisis, right? Like that we've seen this escalation of evidence that suddenly is like unavoidable now. And so I'm wondering in terms of, it's this expansive story where it takes place around this the central UN organization, the Ministry for the Future, but it involves so many different actors that will be required, from scientists to finance to central banks. And so as you were writing and kind of imagining this scenario and kind of having to, as you just put it, lower the bar, right, to make it seem feasible while also successful, right? Like what were some of the kind of creative what were some of the creative solutions that you found, both through like your imagination, but also through like the research that you were doing, that you found either surprising or interesting, and in that they were unexpected?
Well, I can say a couple of things to lead into that. The Ministry for the Future is science fiction, and that wasn't Bill McKibben, but probably a headline writer at the New York Review of Books, which is a venue that isn't used to talking about science fiction in a serious way. So McKibben, who is a friendly acquaintance and a great force in trying to get through this century in a good way with his activism and his writing, is not responsible for that headline. The Ministry for the Future is science fiction. It's just a particular kind of science fiction. And then also, it's not out of my imagination. Almost everything in this book is just reporting of things I find out there. And that's been my method, especially for my near future science fiction, is find what's already going on that seems to have a trajectory towards the good. And if it were to prosper and increase, if it were to scale, as they say today in economics, which is to say gets paid for to be expanded rapidly, gets invested in, that kind of scaling, then things might get markedly better. So in those things, well, the main one that the book pursues is precisely this idea of paying for it, of scaling, of investment. If we only invest in what is now the highest rate of return type activities, we are not going to succeed. in coping with climate change, because our activities are mispriced. They're improperly priced. They're usually a kind of a Ponzi scheme in which the future generations are cheated so that present generations can get away with things and make money or make a profit, but in ways that are not sustainable because damage has been done that isn't getting paid for. That's sometimes they call this negative externalities, but it's also just the ordinary operation of the current economic system is to exploit the natural world, human workers, but also definitely the future generations who aren't here to defend themselves. So a ministry for the future, in part, would be a rejiggering of the economic systems to pay the true cost for what we do, at which point everything changes. And what's interesting then is, well, how do we pay ourselves to do the good things rather than having people make a profit out of doing bad things, non-sustainable extractive things? There, I ran across ideas for what is being called a carbon coin. And really, that's a central feature of my novel. The idea that the central banks of the world would support a kind of quantitative easing, a creation of new money dedicated to decarbonizing activities. And if you did them as an individual or a town or a region or a nation state, you would get paid in carbon coins that would trade in a robust way with ordinary currency. So it's not a cryptocurrency, it's not a private thing. It's central banks, it's what they call fiat money. It's the money that you believe in. In effect, it's US dollars that you're getting paid to do decarbonizing work. And this is in the initial creation of that money, so it can't be diverted anywhere else. So when you follow the implication of that, what's interesting to me about that is it uses the already existing financial system. Quantitative easing got us out of the 2008 crisis, and it got us out of the 2020 pandemic crash. In other words, a whole lot of money was generated by central banks and put out into the economy. If they were put out specifically for decarbonizing projects, then you wouldn't have to make a profit by finding ways to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, because that CO2, once sucked out of the atmosphere, is useless. It doesn't, nobody wants it. It would have to be tucked away somehow. So paying for that needs a new kind of financing. That a lot of it is straightforward Keynesianism. It goes back to the way we responded to the Depression and to World War II, to where government simply paid businesses to do what the government wanted it to do. And in this case, instead of prosecuting the war, it would be squeaking out of an ecological catastrophe that would hammer us all, almost like a war. So that's by far the most interesting idea that I came across. There were several others in my book. It's a long novel. There's all kinds of aspects, as you pointed out. But maybe that's the one I can stop at here.
Right, because it is this challenge in terms of capitalist culture, right? Is all about the present. It's all about externalizing costs to people either without power or towards the future. And so, a number of other cultures will take into account future generations and feel responsibility and obligation for them. But it is this problem with capitalist culture. So I teach a class on culture and climate change at Vanderbilt University. And, one of the things that I have the students do is go out and do these informal polls of other students on campus. And it's so interesting because there's always every semester, there's this theme of where people will say, the people they interview, and, it's an informal poll on campus, but they'll say okay, well, how concerned are you about climate change? And typically it's on the lower end. And then how much do you think the climate change will affect your life? On the lower end. And then it's how much do you think future generations will be affected? And it's on the higher end, right? And so it's interesting to see that it feels like the future generations are very easily foreclosed, right? Are taken out of the conversation. I feel like we can see that, Fridays for Future, that, youth today are leading and have been leading, climate change activism and really pushing for, for change, because they have more of their future is they're fighting for more of their future, and parents will be talking about, we use children and or imagine children or imagine grandchildren as a form of accountability. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about this concept of kind of this problem about how do we account for responsibilities towards future generations, because it's so much a part of this crisis that we're in, right? And that we don't tend to feel an obligation towards them.
Yeah, well, it's very convenient and it's very common. In economics, there's the discount rate. So when you're calculating the value of an activity, you discount the future by a percentage. That means the farther out in the future it is, the less value you give it. And so this is part of the financial calculations made for the worthiness of an action in the present. And it's done all the time. And setting a high discount rate means that you don't care much about the future generations and that you think they can cope with anything that happens because they'll be richer and smarter, et cetera, than we are. Setting a low discount rate or a zero discount rate is to say that the future generations have exactly the equal moral value to us. So it gets technical at that point. On the more personal level, college students today, call them 20 years old. If they're lucky, they will therefore be around at the end of this century. They will never escape climate change. They are already in it. They are poorly educated and ignorant if they think they aren't already in dangerous climate change. And if a hurricane clobbers them, or being in Nashville, if a wet bulb 35 event were to hit, then they would be in a world of hurt immediately. But also their own selves at age 60, at age 70, are going to be in a world that is vastly different than the one now. It could be in some ways more stable and better if we were to react now and begin the work. It could be terrible if we don't deal with this problem immediately. So I actually find a lot of young people are hyper aware of this problem already because they know they're living into it and they're never going to escape it. In one way, it means their life has a meaning, which is the project of dealing with climate change, because no matter what particular discipline they're interested in, that discipline is going to be involved in the climate change battle. So they've got meaningful work on their plate, shoved in their face. They can't avoid it. If they want it, it's there. So the idea that future generations will have to cope with this, but we not, that's thinking from like when I was an undergraduate. And so in other words, it's about a half century out of date, or for sure 30 years out of date. And there should, of course, be a freshman orientation class that every freshman has to take that actually brings them up to speed on the global situation, the IPCC reports, but also population, the inequality, the inequity. The world situation is such that it's trembling on the brink. And certainly college students need to know that to be oriented to what they're going to do in this world. Because things can be done. I don't want to suggest, and this is another easy out, just to say, oh, well, game over, we're doomed, we might as well party because there's nothing can be done. In fact, the 2020s are critically important. Good things done now could have great consequences. Ignoring it now could have terrible consequences. So the situation is really quite intense. For older people, I think it has to do with your children, with your grandchildren, with thinking about the future generations of being just as human as you. And when they come around, they should have all the wild animals. Those shouldn't be things that got killed off that will never come back in the 21st century. So dodging the mass extinction event is a kind of a moral imperative for our time, because we're the ones that are stuck with quickly getting to a right balance with the biosphere that supports us and dodging that mass extinction event. So all these, it's heavy stuff. And one of the things I think happens is you're 20, you're in college, traditionally that would be a zone of freedom and a time to have fun. Of course, there's pressures. Of course, it's intense and hard work and all that, but it's also a time of finding your friends, maybe your partners, maybe your job, your calling. And so to have such a dark message dropped on your plate, like you can never escape climate change. It is the overriding historical problem of your time. It reminds me somewhat of what it must have felt like in the 1930s. Imagine you're a college student and it's 1935. Well, you're doomed. You can see the slippery slide down into a world war where you're very likely to get killed. And so what do you study? How do you party? How do you think about your own life? The only thing I would say that makes our time better than that is that that was a war of people against people that was somewhat pointless and was truly horrid. In this case, it was a semi-accident that we've fallen into the climate crisis. Nobody quite understood that burning so much fossil fuels was going to change the climate so drastically and so disastrously. And now we have to respond as an international group. So what I try to say to undergraduates to encourage them is, yes, we're in an existential world crisis. Every human's on the same team here, so you don't have to have that horrid feeling of war.
Mm-hmm. So there's a comment from Elizabeth Meadows, who completely agrees with the idea of a required first-year course on climate change and inequality. Because what I've seen in terms of teaching undergrads is that very few of them have had any formal education on the climate crisis. And it's actually, some of the students will take AP and like environment, like this AP environment class that is known as like the Easy A class. It's the Easy A AP class. So that's some of the only ways that but I've been very surprised at how few have actually had any formal training about the climate crisis. And I think it brings up to your point about, like if students are actually forced, or young people or anyone is forced to confront the crisis, then they see it as it's not just about dystopian futures, but also about the possibility of transforming society for the better, which is, I think, what I found so profound about this novel, right? Is that it is about providing people with meaning, right? About providing people for meaning. And on the one hand, the climate crisis exacerbates all other problems, right? In terms of refugees and global inequalities, right? Like of gender inequalities. It can exacerbate all these problems, but in the solutions to the climate crisis can also be found a lot of resolution of these problems. And so I just really appreciate your kind of framing this in terms of it can provide meaning for people, right? Because I think that what can end up happening if we end up kind of being enamored by dystopian visions, which is very easy in our current moment, then it ends up just creating anxiety. And as you said, like either a kind of embrace of, well, there's nothing to be done, right? Or like spinning out into like this very individualized depressive response, an anxious response. And so I do really appreciate that, one thing about the novel is that on the one hand, there's, a lot of like economic theory, there's a lot of, scientific advances and new technologies, but the characters also, have a lot, especially the central characters still have a lot of joie de vivre, right? In terms of there's a lot of kind of celebrating this doing meaningful work. Right, and like finding meaning in that.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about now. I mean, Vanderbilt is Nashville's university. It's a private university. The students that go there come from the American upper middle class, but also they've had to be real high achievers in high school. They've already lived a stressful, tense life. If they didn't do very, very well in high school, they wouldn't have got in Vanderbilt in the first place, but then also it's expensive. So this combination of factors gets you a particular demographic. And I don't suppose actually that it's Vanderbilt's students that are actually watching our conversation, but I can use them as an example of people who will end up having expertise. Their college education will perhaps lead to further college education, but probably, or either that or else good jobs. relative to people who are just working for wages at the bottom end of our economy. So that's a particular demographic, and you can perhaps imagine in that situation that, well, I'm going to be okay no matter what happens. It's not quite true. But also, you got to dodge what I would call the 1980s trap of the whole point of life is to make a lot of money. The bumper sticker, whoever dies with the most toys wins. This was a semi-cynical, semi-serious, semi-sarcastic poke at a value system. American consumerism, what's the point of it? You end up working your butt off in order to make money, in order to pay off mortgages, and then you're dead and your work hasn't done anything. And that perpetuates through a system like rats on a wheel. People of my generation have lived that out. It would be better to have meaningful work, work that furthers the cause, that decreases inequality, that creates a more sustainable culture, that adds to the ability of civilization to get forward, that saves other animals, that helps other people. That kind of meaningful work is the only true happiness. And if you can also make a living at it and even have some security at it, like a middle-class salary job rather than wage precarity, all the better. So what I'm saying is that the climate emergency is so severe that all across the sciences, technology, medicine, also the humanities, also the arts, they all apply to this overriding existential crisis. So if there's any silver lining to the very dangerous situation that we find ourselves in, it's that now you can have meaningful work if you want it. So first you have to be alerted to that, the danger, the possibility, and then you have to go for it. And the people who are watching, this is a group of people interested in books, because this is a literary festival. Well, book readers are, again, a particular demographic of middle-class Americans who are interested enough in ideas and also like to imagine what it's like to be other people, because that's what fiction readers do. Or they're interested in history, because that's what nonfiction readers read. And that crowd is already hyper attuned to this, and basically needs to spread the word further to non-readers that reading is an incredibly valuable activity for enlarging your life, but also it brings news that people need to know. This wet bulb 35 temperature that we're scraping at the edge of, Nashville, like a lot of America, is susceptible to heat and humidity in combination. You all know that better than I do, because I'm from California, which is a Mediterranean climate. But in the American South, you often get heat and humidity together, and there's a heat index on most of the weather channels. And a heat index is what wet bulb temperature is, and a combination of heat and humidity high enough, humans die in it if they don't have air conditioning. And electrical systems often fail when they're stressed heavily by climate incidents of this kind. So this is actually a mortal danger hanging over all areas that have high heat, high humidity in combination. So it seems to me that it's a present enough danger, it's an overriding situation, and it has a political and social aspect to it, and it's going to condition every young person's life. It's very much worth discussing. And I suppose maybe we can move on to, okay, that being said, what can the novel do with that? And can it still be fun to read about it? Which is, of course, a separate problem, but it's not a non-problem, because novels are there to be for fun as well as for education.
Yeah, and I'm wondering how you approach that in your work, because clearly this was, with this novel, you're taking on, trying to figure out what is this utopian, like how can we actually make a believable utopia, right? But you're also really pushing, it's very character driven, and so I'm wondering how you walk that line in terms of wanting,
In this case, for Ministry for the Future, given the dire nature of the material, like an emergency that could turn so dystopian, I thought what would make it fun to read as a novel is the game of forms that you don't know. There's 106 chapters, so the chapters are rather short. you don't know what kind of text you're going to get in the next chapter. It is not continuous. It's not like an ordinary novel. I've done ordinary novels and I know what they're like. And in this case, I blew up the form to include riddles, meeting notes, various kinds of dialogues, radio transcripts, ordinary novel scenes between Mary and Frank and Badim, and then also eyewitness accounts. And so eyewitness accounts are kind of something in nonfiction, collections of people who saw something in history and saw it themselves. They were eyewitnesses, and then they tell the collector of the anthology what they saw that day. So they tend to be different from fictional scenes. You never describe what you had for breakfast on the day when the revolution began. You get right to it. You cut to the chase. It's a very propulsive form of storytelling. It's still storytelling, but it's first person and it's witnessing. This is what I saw that day. So I made up about 50 eyewitness accounts that are scattered through that text. You don't know the names of these people. They don't bother to give you their name or their background, not much of it. They get to the point and then they tell you something about that day. So I thought I could make it a kind of a literary entertainment that had a non-fictional substrate, or it was about our serious climate crisis, but it was about us dealing with it well by people put on the spot doing the right thing on a kind of an emergency basis. And making it exciting in the form of, in some ways, a kind of detective story, like how did it happen or why did it happen? So all kinds of modes got thrown into a big slurry, and that was the way that I tried to keep this a novel and not just a long series of op-ed pieces, for instance.
And so Karen asks, Ministry for the Future draws on so many different philosophical ideas. Could you talk a little about your writing process? So do you start with a philosophical idea first, or with characters and stories? Karen adds, full disclosure, philosopher and Hegelian Marxist here. So.
Well, that's good to know. And as a devoted student of my advisor, Frederick Jameson, I am fully with you, although trailing behind as I always do in trying to keep up with Jameson and the whole tradition there. But what I start usually with is with a situation. What if we were to go to Mars and try to inhabit that place? What if all the Europeans died in the Black Death and the empty continent was filled in by people from Africa and Asia? What would world history be like? So these situations, and maybe those are rather big. Those are my longest novels. What if we tried to get to the nearest planet and inhabit that? What if we inhabited the solar system? What if the National Science Foundation tried to fight climate change directly from a science agency? So these what ifs come first. And then I try to elaborate an array of characters that would be interesting to follow in that situation. If you're going to terraform Mars, what if there's someone who hates that idea? They need to be a character. Someone who's pushing it harder than it ought to be pushed, that needs to be a character. Someone who's on the fence or is equivalent, or the go-between. Someone pointed out to me just earlier today that the bureaucrat that tries to orchestrate experts into an effort, you don't see that character very often in most fiction, but in my fiction, they show up almost every time. The go-between, the organizer, the fixer. These are interesting characters because they often have maybe ethical double binds or quandaries, decisions that they have to make. They're put in a hotspot one way or another. So in that array of characters and that general situation, I throw the dice, see what happens. It's kind of, the writing of the novel itself is an improvisation where I do scene after scene. I start at the beginning, I go through to the end. I look at a giant pile of disastrous pages and I start hacking.
That's really great that's really a great description. So I'm going to ask another question from the audience. So Matt asks, you mentioned earlier that dystopian sci-fi may be easier to write than utopian sci-fi. Why is that? Is it just that we're better at noticing the bad than articulating the good?
Yeah, the bad is a story right away. In fact, it occurred to me a decade or two ago that a novel is the story of something going wrong. So if something hasn't gone wrong, you've got anthropology. You don't have the novel. We like to learn about how other people live, what ordinary life is like in other times. But a plot is when something goes wrong there. And this is why detective stories work so well and are such a tempting template for a story. Something goes wrong right at the start, and then you have to do the anthropology to figure out why did it go wrong. I like that, and I've been using that since I had that realization, which I wish I had had like 2 or 3 decades earlier. But dystopia now is a kind of comfort food. We are trembling on the brink of so many disasters, and when you just follow them out in full, you get into zombies. You get to magical realism where it's so bad that you can't even imagine it. The true bad dystopia would also be boring and painful and trivial, and let me emphasize boring. That's why the zombies come into it, so that you can still have drama when everything's gone to hell. But a real disaster would be more like starvation and begging your neighbors for food, and then maybe getting into fights and then getting injured or killed. And this whole dystopian post-apocalyptic imaginary is very easy to follow down the slippery slope to a nightmare. But we're not there yet. So dystopia serves as a kind of comfort food. You read a dystopia and go, oh, those poor people. Oh my gosh. Sure, I'm glad I'm not alive in the year 2140 or whatever, because I've got it good here. And that's how it functions as a kind of comfort, that although it feels scary now, at least you can still go down to Starbucks. Whereas the poor people in dystopia are shooting each other with arrows for rich people's entertainment. To speak of a very great dystopia, the Hunger Games, which there's an emotional truth to a thing like Hunger Games. We're suffering and rich people are laughing at us. The emotional truth of that is what catapulted Hunger Games into the national attention, along with a great movie star. But nevertheless, enough is enough. It's time to try to imagine how we could get to the good place and make that also equally entertaining, because it will be filled with problems. It isn't like getting to a good place is not dramatic. It will be very dramatic and filled with failures and close to the edge situations, nail biters. It's just that nail biters can also turn out all right. So that's where I've tried to focus my fiction.
Fantastic. So I want to ask this question about, so there's a scene in Ministry for the Future where the global elite are gathering in Davos and are held hostage, right? There's a hostage situation where they're all gathered, they're all, wanting to experience this luxury and kind of pretend to care about social issues, and then they're held hostage and basically forced to watch videos and be lectured to about the consequences of their lifestyles and the consequences of the current world system, right? And it was such a disheartening scene, because they were like, the response by so many was just to say, like, we don't really care. We'll get out of this. We don't have to, we don't have to, like, we know that it's bad. We know that people are suffering, but we just don't really care. And so I'm wondering, in terms of thinking about, this thought experiment that you went through of creating this world through the novel, like, how do you, from going through that thought experiment, how do you think we could actually force decision makers, what will it take for, like, the elite, for decision makers to actually be transformed into actually finding some of these solutions, as opposed to either giving them lip service?
Yeah. Well, several things come up there, because that scene in the novel is somewhat of a joke, but elsewhere in the novel, similarly, rich business elites are getting murdered in their beds, and the rest of them are getting scared by that. I would not recommend either one of these tactics as being successful. What works is rhetoric, and which is to say, persuasion. And enlightened self-interest for people who are that rich. I want to also comment on the word elites, because especially in your field of study, you know this very well, that elites can be the people who are bad, who are powerful, who are controlling us, who are not elites. But scientists and diplomats, bureaucrats, these are also can be called elites. And there's where a problem comes. Because if people who are doing devoting their entire lives to trying to make a better world are being dumped into the same category as rich people who are trying to hold on to their privileges no matter what happens to the rest of us, if those two get jumped into one category, then you've got an enemy that also includes the people that are doing their damnedest to make the situation better. So you have to destrand elites from experts who are scientists, technocrats, diplomats working for a better world. And it isn't necessarily true that they're rich, but let's just say extremely privileged, safely wealthy people who want the status quo to stay the same because they're scared of any alternatives. If things were given equally to everybody, they would suddenly be poorer and less powerful. So they would rather keep things the way they were, no matter the dangers. So you could split that out between scientists and capitalists as a way to divide the elites. And it's a necessary division, or else you get that populist, nativist, everybody educated is against me type view that you yourself study. And I've just noticed this recently as a ploy in rhetoric that we need to follow up on that. And then as for the rich people who would prefer to ignore this problem, to the extent they exist, you have to re-educate them, not by kidnapping them, although it's a funny idea to me, but by insisting on shoving their faces in the fact that, okay, their sperm counts are a quarter of what they were 70 years ago. They cannot pay their way out of this poisoned world. They can't get on a fortress match and good enough. Their spaceship to Mars is too late and not good enough. And you have to hammer on them that it's all for one, one for all, and that they can't pay their way out of the climate crisis, the environmental crash, which includes, hilariously, a drastic reduction in sperm counts because of endocrine disruptors that are everywhere, like nanoplastics, and nanoplastics might even be involved. There's only one solution, which is to get into a right relationship with the biosphere by following the sciences, and the rich can't buy their way out of that one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have only a couple of minutes left, but I feel like that's kind of a good place to end. You've written, and the novel addresses this, kind of common axiom that it's easier to imagine the end of the planet than the end of capitalism. But I also feel like for a lot of elites now, it's easier to imagine terraforming Mars than to solving the climate crisis, right?
Yeah. When you make rockets and you have a lot of money, so I'm thinking of 1 or 2 billionaires in particular, the people I call the space cadets. You could briefly entertain that fantasy, but I think that's a hobby. I think that's even known to be a fantasy to even those people. So let's make sure that we don't use the word elites anymore, but either experts or the rich or the recalcitrant, and make sure that we split up the people with expertise and power into people trying to do good and bad, just as an ongoing project.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you for writing this fantastic novel. I really hope everyone reads it. Thank you for your time and your comments.
Thank you, Sophie. And thank you, Southern Festival of Books. It'd be fun to show up live at one of these things one day.